Hello, friends. It's been exactly 6 months to the day since the beginning of the lockdown, at least for me personally. I don't know about for you, but it's probably started around the same time. March 13th, to be exact, was the start of the lockdown for me, was the last time that I saw anyone that I know outside of my immediate family. That sounds really dire, but it hasn't been that bad. And so I thought I would commemorate that by taking sort of like a retrospective video on the past 6 months, on things that I've been thinking about, things that I've been doing, thoughts about music and the world and all that. But that project's taken a little longer than I expected. So that's in the works. But I thought, I want to start up a new YouTube channel and do some video stuff. So why not just kick it off with what I'm doing right now, which is I'm reading a book. And this particular book I picked up a couple days ago and started reading some selections of. This is the latest edition of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So this is the hottest contemporary fantasy and science fiction stories. Now, I have 4 selections that I'd like to talk about from this. Because those of you who know me know that I am a particularly big fan of the fantasy genre. Now, I say that, however, I have to admit that I don't read a whole lot of it. I find that a lot of the literary fantasy tends to be a little self-indulgent for my tastes. But that was a broad generalization that I'm hoping to, rectify by reading some contemporary fantasy and finding out if that still holds true or not. So anyway, I picked this up so that I could start reading and just get a broad idea of what does the magazine of fantasy and science fiction think that fantasy is right now, to get my finger on the pulse. And so anyway, I'm going to talk about, and I read and will talk about one fantasy, one science fiction story each, as well as a poem and an essay by the author of the fantasy story that I'm going to talk about, that are all contained within this volume. The 4 selections that I'm going to talk about today are as follows. The short story Weeper by Marc Laidlaw is the fantasy selection for today. The science fiction story for today is called The Cry of Evening Birds by James Sallis. The essay, also by Marc Laidlaw, is called, I believe it's just called Games. Anyway, he talks about Nioh and Nioh 2, the samurai games that came out recently in the last few years. And then the poem for today is called The Writing of Science Fiction by Timons, Esaias, and that is what I'll be starting with in today. The only poem contained within this volume is The Writing of Science Fiction by Timons, Esaias. I'll go ahead and read the whole poem as it's very short. It was the 21st century, first day of a college class, EL-231. The room 100 years old. I thought we'd start with an easy one. How many of you believe in gravity? All the hands shot up. Oh my, I said, you poor things. Now, I am not particularly well versed in poetry, to be completely honest, and so I'm not particularly great at critiquing poetry. However, I think that this poem presents an interesting question through which I am looking at the other works in this collection. And of course, that question is not, do I believe in gravity? Instead, I think that question that is being posed to the class, what is alarming is the unanimous homogeneity of the answers received, and that everyone seems to think the same or believe the same, and that that there's a very firm belief in this one idea, and perhaps that's stifling creativity. As I see it, the fact that the title of the poem is The Writing of Science Fiction, and taking for granted these things that we believe in real life. you know, maybe envisioning a world where gravity doesn't exist, like, you know, this kind of stuff. But I think that can be extrapolated out to other art forms. And for those of you that know me as a composer and as someone who's interested in a lot of different creative fields, I'm constantly searching for this sort of unique feeling of like a sense of wonder and a sense of escapism to almost everything that I do. And I think escapism is very important to everything that we're doing, especially right now, where, you know, everybody needs an escape once in a while from all of the horrors that are going on in the world. I think that's a very vital thing to have. And so I think this poem is addressing one of the things that I am concerned about when I read or experience like narratives in fantasy and science fiction, that they don't give me that sense anymore. It feels like there's a homogeneity to the way writers are approaching the subject of fantasy and science fiction that I am concerned about, and is actually my primary motivation for taking a look at this very new collection right now. I am searching for perhaps authors that alleviate that concern. To sum it all up, I'm looking for that sense of wonder in a new work. And I'm hoping that by the time I reach the end of this volume, or perhaps not, I will have at the very least made an assessment of a few new works. And I think that's an exciting prospect. And I think that every single art form, certainly those of you that know me in composition know that you know, not every single thing that you experience that is new is going to be great. In fact, the vast majority of it is going to be terrible. But you have to, the world needs those people to wade through the garbage to find the great stuff. And so I'm hoping that this might be the start of some of that for me in literature, is diving into the newer stuff and finding if there's things that I really love out of it. So anyway, I'll go ahead and move on over to the fantasy selection of the day. The fantasy selection that I've chosen is Weeper by Marc Laidlaw. An interesting note about Marc Laidlaw is that he was one of the writers on the Half-Life video games. So there's certainly a pedigree that he's got. This particular story is set in a Dungeons & Dragons style fantasy world, high magic setting with wizards and magical cannons and things like that. The general overview of the plot is that there are 3 adventurers. They are bards, and the character through whose eyes we see the story is Plinth, a pregnant woman who is pregnant with a half-gargoyle child. Now, there is a gargoyle character among the trio. It is not clear if that is that gargoyle character's child or not. And that plot point is not really brought up through the story. The general overview is that they have made camp for the night, and they see a shooting star, and then subsequently hear a cry of a creature and go to investigate it. Among the rubble of the crashed star, they find a broken egg and extract a creature from it, but because it's dark, they can't quite see what it is. However, dawn is breaking, and they find themselves surrounded and chased by a group of poachers who had used a magical harpoon to pull down the star and presumably want the rewards from the hunt. So the biggest issue that I have with this story is that many of the details that are given along the way break up the pacing and sort of interrupt the goings on of the story to talk about some of the elements of the world that perhaps flesh out the world of the other stories, but don't do a whole lot to service this particular one. For instance, there is a brief plot point that is brought up about the magical society that exists in this world, where there are sanctioned magicians that can use this harpoon technology to pull down stars to acquire materials or research or whatever, and that these poachers are doing so illegally. And their argument is, well, if these particular people are allowed to, then why shouldn't we? However, it's made fairly obvious that these poachers are very evil people and don't have a very good They don't. There's not like an argument going on there. There's not a moral dilemma about any of this stuff. It's never expanded upon. It's just brought up as a question, and so I feel like those details are kind of wasted on this little short story. There is a twist that occurs later on with the creature, which I will talk about when I get into spoilers, but that'll be a little ways off. But needless to say, I think that those details kind of break up the pacing. There's additional details like the fact that the child is a half gargoyle, which really doesn't contribute to the plot. There's mention that for whatever reason, that aspect gives Plinth, the protagonist, some sort of superior stamina, which seems kind of counterintuitive and honestly doesn't add anything to the chase sequence as they get caught anyway. And the characters feel a little bit lifeless. Now, some of them, like the two that are mentioned in the introduction as recurring characters, Gorlin and Spar, the gargoyle, they might be fleshed out within their own respective stories, and that's probably okay. They're not given a whole lot of detail here. The most detail that they're given is that the gargoyle is strong and Gorlin is weak. So that's about the characterization you get from them. Very little is actually given to Plinth, other than that she's sort of unafraid of the events that are going on around her. Presumably she's sort of an audience surrogate character, and so some of that can be excused, but none of the characters, be it the trio of protagonists, the poachers, are given any real characterization. The creature, which it turns out is able to speak, is given some characterization, and there's some sort of humorous back and forth between the creature and Plinth. But I feel a little bit like that that is off-putting because of some conflicts in tone occur in this. And when I get into spoilers, I'll talk about that. But just briefly, also, the story has a bit of a mechanical feeling to it, as though these characters didn't quite mesh with the story it was trying to tell, or something's going on that makes this feel a little bit like the story had to get to this one moment and everything else is kind of in service of that. But at the same time, there are also these sort of messier elements about the ongoing universe that interrupt it. So I can't help but feel that this story is a little messy. I like the premise. I like the general arc of the story, and there's this chase sequence that occurs that precedes the actual reveal of what the creature is very well written. But I think it's the other aspects that drag it down for me a little bit. So now I'll go ahead and get into spoilers if you wish to actually read the story, which I would recommend. It's an interesting little read, at the very least for the premise, which is somewhat unusual. Then go ahead and skip now. Getting into spoilers for The Weeper. The plot essentially unfolds that the creature that the trio has found is some sort of gelatinous young creature with wings that Plinth essentially revives to health. And when the poachers catch up to them, the creature hides within Plinth's clothes. And the poachers then demand that they see whatever they've recovered, and the trio refuses, and they kill Plinth. They cut her throat. At which point, a sort of angel of death appears in order to save Plinth and slaughter the bad guys. And as a sort of like favor for saving this young creature, which it turns out, as the angel is sort of like an angel of death, this creature is a reaper, which is sort of the joke that was going on, that the creature was crying out, and so there's like the assumption you would make that the creature's name is the Weeper because of its cry, but it's actually just that it's young and trying to pronounce the word reaper, which, I don't know, feels a little tonally inconsistent. And when it's juxtaposed with the violence of the scenario, I feel that kind of innocence to the joke kind of doesn't work with that scenario, at least for me. I felt like if it was more of a hard, dark comedy punch, then it would have worked better for me. But as it stands, I felt like that was a bit of an odd juxtaposition with the violence of the scenario of like our protagonist getting cut, and then the complete murder of all of these bad guys. It's a little strange. And so overall, I felt like there were a number of problems, but I have to say that the premise of the story was interesting to me. It's I just kind of felt like it was flawed in its execution. It's essentially a character study of Plenth, and I kind of wish that the story had been stripped down to the bare essentials, just Plenth, her relationship to this creature, the poachers, just eliminated the other characters because they just kind of don't serve a function, and it feels like there's a lot of bloat to this little tiny short story that kind of feels unnecessary. And I understand that a lot of that has to do with the fact that these characters are recurring, the setting's recurring, and there's a broader meta narrative being told here. But admittedly, I don't really fully understand the appeal of that kind of thing. I don't read a whole lot of that kind of story. The closest I can say that I've gotten to that is like the Conan the Barbarian stories. And in the Conan the Barbarian stories, you can, by Robert E. Howard specifically, you can kind of pick up any of those stories, and as long as you have an idea of like, oh yeah, that's Conan is a big dude with an axe or whatever, you can kind of understand what's going on. And there's not like a need for all of the other elements. There's not I'm thinking specifically of like the Phoenix on the Sword is the first Conan the Barbarian story, and it introduces a ton of characters in this political scenario, and it's also occurring late in the character of Conan's life where he's already the king and there's this plot against him, and yet the story manages to get all of this stuff to a cohesive point without feeling like any of those details were extraneous. You have a plot with an evil slave to a wizard who then butchers his master, takes over the power to go and fight Conan and summons a demon, and then Conan slays the demon. No one believes him that this creature was there in the room, and then there's a black shadow, and like it's so wonderfully crafted. And even though there's a lot going on in that story and there's clearly a lot of world building going on, it's all in service of the direction of the plot, where I feel like some of the details are a little extraneous in this story, and I kind of wish that it was just sort of made more concise a little bit, a little tighter. But like I said, I think the premise is strong and like kind of interesting, and I'd like to see more of that kind of thing. I feel like the story does lack a little bit of that like wondrous imagination. There's not a whole lot of imaginativeness to the setting. Essentially, the fantasy elements can be boiled down to real life things, and I kind of wish there was something a little bit more going on there. But anyway, those were my thoughts on The Weeper. Now I'll go ahead and move on to Marc Laidlaw's little article that also appears in this volume on games. Marc Laidlaw's article on games talks about two games in particular, Nioh and Nioh 2, both by Team Ninja. They are historical fantasy, action, adventure, role-playing games in the vein of Dark Souls, if you're familiar with that. So the first game features a actual historical figure of an Irishman who went to Japan and worked with the Tokugawa dynasty, and Nioh 2 concerns the rise of Nobunaga. What Marc is talking about in this article is that the narrative forms of storytelling tend to have a reputation for dismal sequels. The idea that many authors, when they create a story, they have a set beginning, middle, and end, and that work is complete at that point. And when they're asked to go back and write a sequel, it has a tendency to feel forced because you're forcing them to invent new material to sort of cling on to the first thing. Where games don't really have that negative reputation. They actually have a reputation of the sequels being slightly better. And he's sort of laying out why that is in this little article, specifically about these two games, because he says the first Nioh game was well received. It was good, and I've played both of these games, and I think they're both great. And he's talking about the fact that these games are very, very difficult. If you're familiar with Dark Souls, you know that Dark Souls is just known for being difficult. And Nioh 1's difficulty is adjusted through the use of multiplayer and having friends help along in your game. However, his biggest complaint was that in Nioh 1, the character must use an item found in the game in order to access the multiplayer, and those items are very rare in the game, thus making multiplayer actually difficult to end up doing. And he says, you know, the biggest thing that Nioh 2 does to rectify that is just make that item a lot more available. And I agree with him on this point, having played both of those games. Nioh 2 makes the multiplayer much more accessible. The advantage of multiplayer being that if you have more than one person helping you out, then the very difficult fights, you know, you can distract the enemy using one of the two characters while you can get a little reprieve and not constantly face an onslaught of, you know, horrifying enemies. So anyway, his point here is that the iterative design of video games means that they have the potential to be better in their sequels because they're reusing a lot of the elements of the first game and simply modifying and like adapting the elements that weren't so good in the sequel, and sometimes experimenting. And, you know, not every sequel is perfect, but there is not the same reputation of video game sequels being bad that literary sequels do. And so if you don't play a whole lot of video games, that's probably a very interesting observation. As someone who plays more video games than he reads, honestly, that was kind of something I knew about. But anyway, it's an interesting little read if you're not very up to date on your video games. But so yeah. The final selection that I've chosen here is The Cry of Evening Birds by James Sallis. This is essentially the science fiction story that I chose, although it's more accurately described as like speculative fiction. There's not a whole lot of talk of science or technology or anything in it. There is simply a core concept that is expanded upon in this course of the story, and that is modifications, as the story calls them. In essence, this is changing someone's personality in some way, which, according to the story, can be done through a series of forms. A person can submit forms saying, "This is the person. This is the modification I'd like to make." There's not a whole lot of detail that is gone into in this short story. It's only 2.5 pages long, but it does an excellent job of talking about the psychological ramifications of such an idea. The first thing that I thought of when I saw the concept in the middle of the first page of it was the Star Trek Voyager episode Fairhaven, in which Tom Paris has crafted a holodeck program full of characters in this little old Irish town for everyone on the crew of Voyager to essentially go and have fun in their spare time. And because it is simply a program that he created, he can modify characters to have different traits at any time, and the Captain Janeway, becomes romantically involved with the bartender Michael, and over the course of the episode, it asks for certain small modifications to his character, make him taller, make him interested in poetry, and things like that. And of course, disaster strikes on the ship, as it always does in a holodeck episode, and all of the characters get sort of distorted or corrupted, and so much of it can't be saved and all that. And finally, they can bring the Michael character back online. And the discussion is had near the end of the episode of will Janeway change any more of his program, and that it is perhaps unethical for her to be doing that if she is actually to treat Michael as like an existing human being, in essence, a life form on his own. If you're not familiar with the show, there is another character called the Doctor, who is a medical hologram who has this similar dilemma throughout the show, and I believe it is the Doctor who confronts her about this conflict, saying that if you are to treat holographic characters as actual sentient life forms, then why not extend that to the character of Michael and stop editing his subroutines to fit your fancy? So quite similarly, the story "The Cry of Evening Birds" is about a woman who has requested a modification on her husband. The couple had lost a child, and she is aware that it has deeply psychologically affected her husband, Bean. Uh, and so the short 2-page story just basically goes through her psychology of the day after she has submitted the form and before the changes take effect. And all of the ways that she sort of distracts herself from the very clear guilt that this was the wrong decision, or that she fears it was the wrong decision, and it is left with a cliffhanger that the change happens and there's no hint of what the reaction is. So this is a very well crafted little short story. I really liked it. It's tightly crafted. You know, in 2.5 pages, you get all of the information you need to understand all of the problems that this woman thinks that it's actually going to be him having all the problems, but really she's going through all of this like obsessive cleaning, obsessive doing all this other stuff to distract herself from what's going on. It's really excellent. And where the Star Trek Voyager episode ends on a very, you know, moralistic thing of like, you know, we shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. This story seems to hint at, you know, why a society would come to the conclusion that this is okay, and that is to like solve trauma and stuff like that. But it does not condone it. It simply it's cautionary in that, like, you know, the idea is presented as a useful technology that is that still has its own ethical problems. So yeah, I think that was my favorite selection of the 4, and of course I'll be reading through more of this and hopefully providing my feedback along the way. Hope you enjoyed, and see you all soon in another video, hopefully.